Hi, everybody. Welcome to our special year-end Q&A. 2019 has been a very busy year in politics, so we have assembled our CBC journalists to take your questions on the top political stories of the year. Send those questions in at the comment section. If you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, we'll take questions on any of those platforms. Again, you just post them in the comment section. We're here for the next 45 minutes or so, and we're going to try to get through as many of them as possible. Joining me to answer those questions is a group of journalists who've helped us break down the political news throughout the year. In Vancouver, Salima Shivji joins us. And here with me in studio, Katie Simpson, David Cochran, and JP Tasker. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Nice to see you all. It's been so long. I want to start, we're gonna of course get to those questions in a second, but I do want to start with each of you. I know you did this on Instagram already, but kind of identifying what your the big story is, why you think it's the big story of the year, and what you thought of covering it. David, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the story really from the start of the year to the end of the year was SNC-Lavalin. I mean, in February, when the Globe and Mail had their first story, it just dominated the House of Commons. It derailed political careers, and it ultimately diminished a prime minister. If you look at the fact that Trudeau was proven to be a bit more of a conventional politician than he campaigned to be. He lost his top advisor in Jerry Butts. He lost his clerk in Michael Wernick. He lost two cabinet ministers in Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould. Philpott was eventually defeated. Wilson-Raybould is now an independent. And after unleashing this army of lobbyists to exert political pressure on the government, SNC-Lavalin, as we get into Christmas, was able to negotiate a plea bargain that essentially got them everything they wanted from a deferred prosecution agreement. Yes, they get a conviction. Yes, they pay a big fine, and there's probation and oversight, but they get to bid on federal contracts, and that's what that was all about. And the cherry on top to wrap up that story at the end of 2019, Vashi, is that it all happened on the day that Jody Wilson-Raybould was named the Canadian Press Newsmaker of the Year.
Irony is rich. Katie, over to you.
Well, I found that one of the biggest, most important stories that really is connected with Canadians is what's going on between the Canada-China relationship. And the year started with a big cloud over what was going to happen in Vancouver. Meng Wanzhou, who is the Huawei CFO, she was arrested by Canadian authorities at the end of last year, about a year ago this time. And Beijing unleashed a pressure campaign to try and convince the Canadian government to interfere in the judicial system, as were the allegations of the story that David was talking about, to try and free this high-profile Chinese citizen with deep ties to top officials in the government. And since that happened, there have been significant consequences for Canada. Canada saying, no, we are a rule of law country. We are not going to intervene in this. This is something that's before the courts, and we are not taking a political stand on that. Since that time, of course, we did see the detention of the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. They remain in detention at this time, and we really are not getting a lot of information about how they are, what's been going on behind the scenes, other than to say they get a monthly consular visit that lasts about half an hour. And other than that, there isn't much more known about how they're being cared for, if they're receiving proper treatment, what's going on. They still haven't had access to a lawyer, so that aspect of it. But back in Canada, while those two Canadians are in that very difficult situation, here in Canada, Canadian farmers, pork producers, beef producers, have been experiencing a very significant trade challenge when China decided to close its border to Canadian canola, most Canadian canola, when it decided to close its border to pork and beef and meat products. So this has been a dispute that there isn't anything Canada really can do at this point, because Canada is stuck in the middle of China and the United States, and that to me is it is fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and there's going to be a committee this year. I know we'll get into that as well, that will study it, so that should be interesting. JP, what's the big story for you?
Yeah, the biggest story I covered this year was Western alienation, which is always something that's a part of the Canadian reality, but it's really ebbed and flowed over the last 10 years. We haven't really seen it be a major issue on the national front, but it really has flared up this year, in part because there's been so much attention paid to the job losses in the oil patch, over 100,000 by most estimates. People have lost their jobs in the energy sector, but also it's been exacerbated by what the Liberal government has done here in Ottawa on the legislative front by passing some controversial bills like Bill C-69, which overhauled the Environmental Assessment Act, like Bill C-48, which imposed a tanker ban on oil going to ports in northern British Columbia. That also, with a skilled political communicator like Jason Kenney, has really fanned the flames of Western alienation over the last year. It's really taken on more salience, and it really all came home to roost for the Liberals in the election when they lost all the seats in Alberta and Saskatchewan that they previously held. So I really think it's going to be a major challenge for this government heading into this second term, because they're going to have to deal with what really is a feeling that the West is not part of this federation in a real and meaningful way.
You referenced the election, Salima. You were one of our reporters on the campaign trail. What was that like? And I imagine that's probably your big story.
It is, yeah, and really everything everybody has already talked about, Katie, David, and JP, really culminated and came to the forefront in the federal election. Of course, SNC-Lavalin, the whole controversy hobbled the Liberals heading into the federal election. Western alienation became a theme, and after the election as well. But really, of course, the election was what a lot of people in Ottawa were talking about, were following. It was the closest race we've seen in recent memory, with the polls putting the Liberals and the Conservatives so close, and then so many surprises in the election campaign as well. Those twists, those turns, we had those blackface photos come out. A lot of people thought the Liberals would be severely damaged by that, and that was at the very beginning of the election campaign. They ended up not hurting so much with that controversy, and then, revelations that Andrew Scheer was a dual citizen and never disclosed it before. The whole abortion issue, you could see everything change every week. Was pretty fascinating. We're at the edges of our seats during the election campaign, and then feeling the change in the last few days in the final push. So very much interesting to see that on the ground, and to see all of these issues kind of burble and come up, with the Liberals then reduced, of course, to a new reality, to a minority government, where these issues that we're talking about all this year are still going to plague them. Of course, Canada's relationship with China, as well as Western alienation, and how to deal with the Premier. So we've seen the Prime Minister adjust to that after the federal election campaign.
I want to get to all of the questions that we're getting in a second, but first I have one of my own, because I would imagine people who aren't used to covering campaigns, or who don't do it, are interested in what is different about it behind the scenes. Like, what might they not know? Do you have a quick answer to that, Salima?
Well, you may not know that all of us work together. Basically, all the networks are on one bus, and you kind of become a little bit like a family, a little bit of a dysfunctional family, perhaps. But everybody is sort of helping each other. You're doing live sometimes on a bus with a tiny iPhone, and somebody from another media outlet is holding your camera for you to keep it steady as you're rollicking down a highway in New Brunswick, heading to the next whistle stop. So there's a camaraderie that sort of builds up behind the scenes. It gets crazy. The hours can be mental. You feel like you're perhaps going mental sometimes as you're covering things from 1 hour to the next, and it's a 22-hour day at the very end, and you're stopping in 5 provinces on your way to Vancouver for a final whistle stop, sleeping for a couple of hours before you get up again. So the pace is quite something. It's quite amazing to see the politicians do it, and we're along for the ride.
Okay, let's move on to some of the questions that we have received. Terrence Graham on Twitter asks, does the Liberal Party focus on the ridings still on head, or do they concentrate on solidifying the 905-416 in Ontario? I live in NDP Ontario North, and being Liberal up here is tough, he says. Why don't I throw this one to you, David? Talk a bit about the strategy for the Liberals.
Well, I mean, look, they certainly had a strategy in the last election to make gains in a lot of areas where they made some but didn't break through, where they intended Southwestern Ontario, for example. They expected to win all of Hamilton, or wanted to win all of Hamilton. And they still thought they might be able to make some gains out west. I mean, certainly the approach that we have seen since Election Day is to reach out to areas that didn't vote Liberal last time. I mean, they're in a minority situation. They want a majority next time, and you're only going to do that if you can grow where you're successful. I mean, the easiest path to that is probably through Quebec. I think we would agree is where they have the best chance to gain. If not for Bill 21 and a resurgent of Bloc Québécois, it's quite likely the Liberals might have won a majority government on October 21st. So yeah, I mean, they're still going to reach out to the north. I mean, they did okay up there. They couldn't take out Charlie Angus, but Charlie Angus is a tough nut to crack. But yeah, they're going to keep reaching out to places that didn't vote for them. It's the only way a political party can grow.
Katie Kilku70 on Instagram asks, how to resolve the two Michaels affair. You referenced that in your first answer, but obviously, we are mindful of the fact that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been detained for an entire year. You talked a bit about the conditions that they face as well.
And so the big challenge for Canada is that Beijing has made it really clear they want Meng Wanzhou released, and that's when the Canada-China relationship can get back on track. And viewers will remember that Canada did make that arrest. Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the airport in Vancouver at the request of the Americans. A formal extradition request was filed. Canada followed the law, followed through, and made the arrest on behalf of the Americans. Beijing tried to put a lot of pressure on Canada to change that, reverse that, set her free, send her back to China, but Canada has said no, and Beijing has made it very, very clear that if the Canada-China relationship is going to go back to normal, Meng Wanzhou needs to be set free. But at this stage, the Canadian government has said it is a rule of law country and it's going to continue to follow the rule of law. So it puts Canada, Justin Trudeau, when he was first elected, he made it very clear early on, one of his first major international trips was to China. And when the Chinese welcomed him, it was such fanfare, and different business groups, key industry leaders, the top level government officials met and welcomed Justin Trudeau because he was hoping that during, whether it be his first mandate, he was hoping that the possibility that they could launch free trade talks, some kind of free trade talks. China was a big goal for Canada, and because of what's happened over the past 12 months, that goal, that trajectory is completely off track.
Okay, JP, I'm going to take a question from, or kind of a comment, what they think a big story was, and that's from Kyle Bodner. The 2019 Alberta election with the UCP, the United Conservative Party, winning a majority government. Talk a bit about the change in government in Alberta and the impact it's had even on the federal scene.
Well, I think that Justin Trudeau is staring down someone who's a lot less friendly to his cause. I mean, Rachel Notley put up a good fight when she was the Premier of Alberta, but Jason Kenney obviously sees it in his best interest to really take the fight to Trudeau personally. And I think that, Rachel Notley was a defender of her province, no doubt about it, but Jason Kenney really is going to stake his whole political future on saving the oil patch, I think. And I think we are at that point where he has made it clear to Ottawa that if they don't approve a major project like Frontier Mine, which is coming up in February for a final approval, then the whole oil sector is at risk. And he's being quite dramatic about it, but perhaps it's warranted because we have seen the level of investment tank in the province over the last 4 years. It, unfortunately for Rachel Notley, fell under her leadership. I don't think it necessarily was anything that she did other than perhaps implement the carbon tax, which did raise costs in the sector. But he wants to make this his cause célèbre. And anything that goes wrong in the province, I think he's going to stick it to Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. He's going to keep bringing up C-69. He's going to keep bringing up C-48, these bugaboos of his, these things that really he's used successfully to rally this Western alienation cause. I don't think that he's been very clear that he believes in Canada. He's a proud Canadian patriot. But he sympathizes with those people who are feeling increasingly isolated from the people in Ottawa. And I wonder if that's going to work out for him. We've seen some of his poll numbers dip a bit. I think that's probably related more to domestic issues at home, like a really severe. Yeah, he's passed a really severe austerity budget that cuts deeply into things like higher education. So he's definitely taking a different approach, but it might work out for him in the end to, like premiers in the past in Alberta, like Peter Lougheed successfully took on Pierre Elliott Trudeau and secured his place in Alberta history as a champion of that province and of the province's largest industry.
And the NDP was an aberration, right? 4 years of NDP stacked against 40 of Conservative rule there. So they're just kind of also returning to what they know.
Sure.
But okay, let me ask another question. Actually, it's a comment from Day Day on YouTube, and I want to remind everybody who is watching right now to send those questions in, post them in the comment section on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. In the meantime, Day Day on YouTube, and this one's for you, Salima, because you covered the election, but you also cover climate change very frequently. Climate change, he says, or she, is the very biggest of this year, honestly. More just making the comment of how significant the issue is and fighting the effects of climate change. What is your take on how significant this issue will be politically going forward?
It is the central issue, really, for the Liberal government. And they've already shown that in the way that they have, assigned the mandate letters and the ministers in the new cabinet. And of course, it came out of the election as well. It became the central issue. People were predicting it would be the central issue, and it ended up being that 2/3 of Canadians voted for more progressive policies and more action on climate change. And that's really what the Liberal Party was banking on, what they kept talking about on the election campaign trail. They really put a lot of effort into their climate promises, what they would do to fight climate action, planting 2 billion trees and whatnot, really saying that they would make Canada net zero emissions by 2050. Not really saying how we would get there, but promising that they would do that and meet and exceed our 2030 target. So that was central to the Liberal campaign. It is now central to the messaging that they're putting forward, going forward in this new reality and going into the new year. Obviously, we have a new Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, who was very carefully chosen as well by Justin Trudeau and his Liberals. He has a background in clean tech, as an executive in clean tech. He is also from Saskatchewan. So it's a nod to, of course, what JP was talking about in the whole issue with the frustrations in Alberta and Saskatchewan as well. So an Environment Minister that is sort of walking the line, right? Talking and listening to concerns in Alberta and Saskatchewan, talking about that we have to transition away from our dependence on fossil fuels and the oil industry and moving forward with certain policies. Not yet clear which policies they will go forward with quickly, because it will be a bit of a fight in Parliament. I mean, of course, the NDP wants them to go further, wants the Liberals to go further, as do the Greens. They don't have as much power, of course, only 3 seats in Parliament, but those progressive parties on the left are also pushing the Liberals to move faster in terms of tackling climate change. And really globally, of course, the issue has just exploded with Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager, really bringing it to the forefront, becoming also a newsmaker of the year for Time, on the cover of Time magazine. So there you go. It's really in the ether for everybody, I would say, and most particularly for the Canadian federal political scene.
Okay, another strategy question for you, David. Guibor on YouTube asks, was appointing Chrystia Freeland, his loyal deputy, a smart political play by Trudeau? Would she challenge him for the leadership before he runs for another election?
Well, I don't think that will happen. I don't think there's any palace coup coming in this. It's not the Chrétien Martin years. What's interesting about the Chrystia Freeland appointment is that she's not the minister of everything, but she's kind of the minister of everything that matters to the success of this government. She is the lead on anything to do with federal-provincial relations. She still maintains responsibility for Canada-U.S. relations, so she'll probably be seeing Katie in her new job in Washington in the new year. So she is she is in the middle of everything, and it's an interesting move, because if you go through the mandate letters, I think there are 6 or 7 ministers, senior ministers like Bill Morneau, who have to work with her on things that she will take the lead on, and I think the success or failure of this minority government in a very large way depends on her ability to navigate difficult relationships on the federal provincial scene. We've already seen a much lower profile from Justin Trudeau since being elected. He's been meeting with people, but largely staying in Ottawa, not doing this sort of perpetual campaigning thing we've seen from him. She's doing that. She's the new minister of going everywhere and talking to everybody. So there's a lot of pressure on her. I mean, she's definitely seen as a potential leadership successor to Trudeau. I don't think she's seen as a leadership rival to Trudeau, and I don't get any sense at all inside the Liberal Party that her ambitions are going to collide with his longevity.
No, but you know what's one other thing that's interesting with that? Because she has such a significant domestic portfolio, it's going to give her that opportunity while she built Canada's, to network. Yeah, to network in Canada and to really get to know Canadians the way that she sort of left a mark on the international stage. You know, she was known for successfully, keeping NAFTA alive, dealing with the President of the United States, who was completely unpredictable and was ready, willing, and able to tear up the most important trade deal that the Canadian economy relies upon. And given the success in getting that across the finish line now, she has an opportunity to build some more domestic political clout, so that if one day she does want to be Justin Trudeau's successor, she's got.
I would argue she already has a lot of that clout right now. If I'm trying to think of, it just jumped out at me when you were speaking, like all the politicians we've had on the show lately talking about Western alienation, and how many of them, whether it be premiers, Scott Moe, Jason Kenney, or Christy Clark, or critics of the government normally, will not say a negative word about Chrystia Freeland.
We'll see how long it lasts.
We'll see how long it lasts, but they're pretty complimentary.
Yeah. But the question that actually a lot of Liberals have is they agree she'd make a great prime minister, but would she make a great general election candidate? This is what they don't know yet, because foreign affairs and the retail domestic politics is 2 very different skill sets and ways of engaging.
Well, we'll get a taste of how that might work out, I guess, over the next few years,
so,
given her different role. Okay, Katie and JP, maybe I'll get you both to weigh in on this. DoWop54 on YouTube asks what basically all of Ottawa is talking about. Who would you say are the top 3 candidates to replace Andrew Scheer? Pick them right now. One, two, three.
1, 2, 3. Well, here's what we know so far. Aaron,
Very little.
Here we go,
exactly. Very little, and anyone who's talking doesn't know, and those who know don't talk. What is that famous phrase?
I think that's it.
Something like that. Okay,
Close
let's talk about the people that we know would be interested in this and have have run in the past and have sort of taken leadership aspirations. We know Aaron O'Toole. The big question about him is he is a Southern Ontario MP, just outside of in the GTA. He came third in the 2017 Conservative leadership race, and I think he surprised a lot of people with how sort of successful he was, particularly at the leadership convention. He delivered a speech that really resonated with the crowd, saying, hey, I'm this working class guy. You know, I'm 5 years younger than Justin Trudeau, but this is what hard work looks like. And so he delivered and was able to connect in that retail politician kind of way, like, hey, I'm just like you. But the big question is, how's his French? And that's going to be a big question, because they clearly saw that Andrew Scheer, even though he was Speaker of the House, his French was not where it needed to be to connect with those Quebec voters. And he had a disastrous outing at the first French language debate on TVA. And he also his team had a very difficult time executing its Quebec strategy, which again had very negative results for the Conservatives. So they need to look at someone who is going to be able to resonate in Quebec. They know that they've got the prairies locked up. They just need someone who's going to make those gains, whether it be in Ontario and Quebec. Yep. And do they also need a woman in there? After the go of Andrew Scheer, do they need Rona Ambrose to jump in there? She was so popular as an interim leader. People had wished she'd stayed around and questioned whether if she'd still been the leader going to that election, would she have been able to defeat a wounded Justin Trudeau amid his blackface scandal?
What do you think, JP?
Yeah, I think Rona Ambrose would be a formidable contender. She did prove to be very able interim Conservative leader. She bloodied up the Liberals, I think, quite a bit in the first 18 months, more than perhaps most pundits had expected them to go through in those early days when things were looking so good for the Liberals. I mean, when you have people like Scott Moe, Brad Wall, Jason Kenney all coming on side saying, Rona, you got to run. We think you're the best candidate.
And the polling done.
And the polling, absolutely. And I think Katie's onto something. Maybe it's time for a woman. Maybe it's time for a little bit of a change at the top. Again, it goes back to the French factor. I mean, she's spoken in French. We've seen her in the House, but there's always a cue card.
But also, let's throw some gossip in here. What if to neutralize her because the Liberals see her as a very strong contender? Do they offer, hey, would you like to be the ambassador in Washington? You were on the NAFTA Council. Yeah. It went very well.
Very tempting, right?
There you go. And that neutralizes her, and that would make some. I bet Conservatives want to win, obviously, but those Conservatives who are hopeful to become leadership candidates, I don't think that they would necessarily object to that either.
Look, you got a lot of names out there. Peter MacKay's name obviously keeps coming up. Jean Charest reportedly today is thinking about it. Help Me Rona seems to be the crawl of the Conservative Party, but the big question they have to answer as a party is the electorate may want a more moderate and progressive Conservative leader, but does the party and the membership itself
That's why I think Rona's best, because she has been a red Tory on some issues like same-sex marriage. You'll remember she came out right away after the last election saying, we want a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which the Harper government was dead set against. She's been very vocal about her support for LGBTQ, right? She marched in pride parades. She is very much a social progressive, but kind of also can be palatable to the West and Alberta and Saskatchewan when they're really gung-ho about,
although we don't
let's get those
necessarily,
pipelines
I mean,
built.
the only caveat I would say is we don't necessarily, and Salima, I want to ask you what you think. We don't necessarily know where she stands, for example, what policy she'd advocate for on climate change, which was another big issue for the Conservatives during the campaign. Like she was environment minister under a time where they weren't meeting they aren't meeting the targets now, but they weren't under the Harper government either. So I mean, there will be some tough questions for her should she decide. But you're right, everyone is talking about it. Salima, what do you think?
I would say very much in terms of Rona Ambrose, yes, the questions about her position on climate, that's going to be really important for the Conservative Party going forward, because that's what a lot of them, the members and the defeated candidates were also talking about, that we didn't have a credible climate plan to present at the door. And people were asking about that in Ontario and particularly in Quebec. And that is, of course, key as well. And perhaps the Conservative Party isn't thinking about it as much, but they really do, as you guys have all mentioned, need somebody that is palatable to voters in Quebec to build their support there. And that needs to be somebody who is a little bit more on the progressive side, is talking climate change and can speak French, if not totally fluently, passably.
But she's the one who scares the Liberals.
Yeah,
Rona Ambrose is the candidate who worries the Liberals.
Let me ask you this exact question. Thank you. Leg Girl 1982, you read her mind on YouTube.
That's my burner
That did
account.
not.
That's my burner account.
I did not think about that before I said it, but she asks, should the Liberal government be afraid about their electoral perspectives if the CBC moves to the centre, especially on the environment and social issues?
I mean, that's where they're vulnerable, and they Doug Ford and demonizing Conservatives and cuts and the approach of Doug Ford, who's now under new management and changed his tune, that's not a strategy you can necessarily employ 2 elections in a row. And Ambrose is a candidate that it's very difficult to paint a pro-LGBTQ, pro-choice woman as sort of a closet social conservative, or, we're probably not going to find out she's an American who never actually sold insurance in the middle of a campaign. Right. There's more openness and an ability to communicate and not fumble. Because, look, a big part of what happened in the last election wasn't so much that Trudeau won it. The Conservatives blew it. I mean, they did not run a good campaign. Their polling was miserable. Their message was poor. And their platform was completely unimaginative. So, new life, new vigor, new opportunity. But she's the one who worries them. And if she does moderate and can appeal, and a big part of the Liberal strategy was to scare soccer moms in the 905s in a massive way, and that really came into play in the final week. It's hard to make them afraid of Rona Ambrose.
Okay, I have a great question here that Katie, I know, is going to love answering. Kelly Ian on YouTube asks, this is a diversion from the Hot Topics portion of the program, and said, how do you as individuals cope, we were just talking about this, with the onslaught of trolling comments or insults when reporting on politics? It must be awful sometimes.
Okay, let's pull behind the curtain here. So sometimes I ignore it. And then sometimes I don't. I was wearing a $20 shirt from an American, big box, really cheap retailer. And someone was like, the Americans must have gotten to Katie Simpson. She's glammed up. And I replied saying, I'm wearing a $20 shirt from, I don't want to say the name of the store because we're journalists and you shouldn't say that, but it's from a low end, rhymes with Margit. It's really low. Not that I'm trying to hate on a company. Anyway, so I'll respond to that. And it blew, it blew up, and I didn't mean it. And then people are like, you need to ignore the trolls. You're feeding the trolls. So you know what? I don't know. Sometimes I read it, sometimes I don't. I don't care. Troll me. Come at me, bro.
It's pretty fun.
What
do you guys think?
I just mute them. I don't really pay that much attention to it anymore. I mean, it's hard because sometimes you want to engage with people who are asking legitimate questions about your stories.
And some criticism is legitimate as well.
100%.
I'm open to it.
And I've changed stories.
It's constructive.
And I've changed stories and gone back and looked at things twice because someone's raised a legitimate point. I'd say that's a tiny fraction, though. A very
that's maybe
small
one
minority.
of every 1,000 trolling comments you get is legitimate.
Literally.
I would estimate. That's my very accurate calculation.
Sometimes I'll get sucked into a bot cycle, and these insults will be thrown at me that don't make sense. Someone once called me a grease mouth, and I was like, "Whoa, that's amazing!" I was like, it's a robot reading. It's a bot. It's for 1,000 hours, this robot read 1,000 pages of insults and came up with insults of its own. Have you seen those?
No.
Have you seen those things on
idea what
Twitter?
you're talking about.
Okay, the people on the internet will know what I'm talking about. You will know what I'm talking about. It's they'll set up a bot to say this bot watched 1,000 hours of Olive Garden commercials and came up with its own Olive Garden commercial, and it's this gobbledygook that makes no sense. It's no family, olive bread, and it's these hilarious kind of things. And I think I got sucked into one of those bot cycles once, and someone called me grease mouth, and I got people in the office who are calling me grease mouth because I just.
How come I didn't get to call you that?
You could. You could. You know
Grease
what?
mouth joins us from Washington now.
There you go, grease mouth.
Over to you.
This just in.
David, what do you think?
Social media is a pitiful hellscape full of angry people who just want to hurt people.
What do you really
and
think?
it's angry. But other than that, it's lovely. Look, I have quality filters on. I'd say 99% of the tweets that come at me, I just don't see because it's not worth my mental health and time. And I think as things go on, I do not engage on social media anymore. I used to enjoy it when it started. I thought it was very democratizing and accessible.
I agree. It used to be
and
great.
a good way to have conversations with people and meet people and engage. But now it's just become a hate fest, and I don't enjoy it.
Salima, what about you?
Rest in peace, my mentions.
Did you just say hate fest? Yes.
A hate fest, yeah.
It has descended, into a kind of this world of vitriol, and that I just have to try to ignore it. I try to ignore it. I have some mutes on. You just cope with it and kind of go like this. Sometimes, though, they are funny. They are funny. The comments are funny.
No
even if they're a little bit mean.
No newsroom has figured out how to deal with it yet.
No, that's a good
the thing.
point.
No one's
I feel
figured
like
out.
we're on our own pretty much. Like you have to decide for yourself. I feel
Yeah.
like it used to really bother me. Like when mostly when people would say like you're fat, I used
Oh
to
my
cry
God.
10 years ago, and now I'm like,
Now I'm like,
I'm
grease
fine.
mouth here.
Yes.
No, someone
don't
picked
care.
me in one of those like yesterday.
You really
It's
get
like,
over
oh,
it, right?
You do.
Protect your appearance and yeah.
All right, let's move back to the serious subject matters at hand.
serious.
I have one for our finance expert, David, here.
no.
This is an interesting one that I think we actually don't talk about a lot. But Barry Campbell on Facebook asks, if the deficit continues to rise, what will happen to interest rates for homes, et cetera? I mean, it's an interesting question given the fiscal update this week, which saw a bigger deficit thanks to the promises that the Liberals made during the campaign. And the Prime Minister and others have been defending those numbers this week as well.
Right. So,
have their reasons.
look, I know there's a big screaming match about the deficit every time we get a fiscal update and a budget, but the reality is, and again, come at me in my Twitter mentions, the government is on a fairly modest economic and fiscal track. The deficits are eye-poppingly large numbers for normal people. They are not eye-poppingly large numbers for a G7 country with an economy the size of Canada, and you're getting consistent growth rates of 1.7, 1.8%, and it's outpacing what interest rates are. The deficits can have a factor on interest rates if they get out of control, but inflation is reasonably within the target range, so the Bank of Canada, if anything, is under pressure to maybe cut rates to try to give a little jolt to growth. So it's something they have to manage, but the deficit as a percentage of the economy is still quite small. The big jump we saw recently in the fiscal update had to do with a reevaluation of future pension liabilities, which is a problem that is actually caused by low interest rates. Because when your interest rates are low, your bonds don't make big revenues, so pension funds don't make big money, so it costs more for them to meet their liabilities. So you could have a spike in interest rates, which will affect the government's debt servicing costs, but it will alleviate some of their pension liabilities because the rate of return on the bonds and the pension funds will be higher. So they have a fiscal track that is still getting them a AAA credit rating. They argue that it is putting resiliency and stimulus into the economy, allowing us to keep the growth we have and avoid the recession that the Conservatives are warning about. The Conservatives argue you should be keeping fiscal room to deal with an unexpected downturn, but right now, none of the independent experts they consult are predicting a recession. Slow down, flat growth, but not contraction.
That's something I think that I'll be watching for this year that I'm interested to see. JP, I wonder what you think as well, because the government, like from my reading of the fiscal update, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like they're a bit more optimistic than, let's say, the Bank of Canada, which highlighted risks to a bigger degree. Maybe something else is happening behind the scenes, but I know there's a political conversation, but there's an economic one taking place too. Like, what does the future hold?
Yeah.
There's going to be a recession at some point. When will that happen? Is it really inevitable? That kind
The
of
problem for them is that this $26.6 billion deficit they posted on Monday does not include any of the new spending that they promised in the last election campaign. So they keep moving the markers on what's acceptable, right? They said at least if we keep the debt to GDP ratio at a certain number and it keeps going down year over year, that means we're in a safe debt zone. But if they pile on billions more spending to enact their election platform, give the provinces what they want in terms of a healthcare change or to boost up the fiscal stabilization program, there's no way they're staying at $26.6 billion unless, of course, those pension liabilities all of a sudden take a turn, which in a good sense, take
Or your revenues go up,
or the
you
revenues
cut in
go up,
other
but they'd have to
areas.
raise
I mean, there are
taxes.
options.
So,
Well, the economy could do better.
I mean, perhaps, yeah. They were showing anemic growth, 1.7%.
But haven't they've cut a big hole in the revenues as well with the tax cut, right? Like eventually, so they'll have to.
That'll cost them $6 billion by year 4.
I mean, we were on basically 10 years of growth for the economy, right, since the last recession.
Yeah.
We've seen quarter after quarter of positive unemployment and job gains, except for November, of course. The economy is basically, most economists agree on the last legs of this boost cycle. We might start to see it taper off even more than it is over the last couple of months. So that's a problem because that means we will see that spike in the debt to GDP ratio because the GDP, of course, is a measure of our economy and how well it's doing and how much it's growing by. So,
but the political,
this is a
I find
real
it interesting
tickle
also
for them.
the political conversation has changed a lot. I would even say in the years that I have been covering politics, insofar as even the Conservatives in the last campaign essentially promised the same level of spending and the same deficit that the Liberals had prior to the campaign. Yes, they added to it with their campaign promises, but even at the most conservative end of things on this political spectrum, there was still a big deficit that was going to be run this year, and voters appear
don't care.
I mean, I don't want to conclusively speak for all of them, but that calculation seems to be
Look at
happening.
Doug Ford and Jason Kenney, who are the hardline fiscal conservatives, who have made deep cuts in their province. They've seen their numbers tank, right?
Well, I don't know if Doug Ford for sure. Jason Kenney has seen a hit lately, but I don't know if it's directly tied to that.
It's been pretty negative reaction to
Yeah.
that budget, right? So
Yeah, that's fair.
it's a problem.
People still look at it like it's the 1990s, when the debt to GDP ratio was like 67% as opposed to 29%, which it is now. And at a time when the IMF was threatening to downgrade Canada to essentially junk bond status, right now, I think groups like the IMF, the OECD, are saying what Canada is doing is sort of a model for sustainable economic growth and helping the low and middle income citizens get ahead. So, I mean, the crisis language is still looking at this through 1990.
Right? We're not Greece, we're not
Hey,
Portugal.
hey.
No
Leave my
offense.
people alone. Leave them out of
Don't let
this.
them finish your books.
My
We're not
goodness.
going to be an
You'd be
economic
lucky to visit the
mess.
islands.
Take me to Mykonos. Yeah.
So, Salima, what do you think about that?
Sorry, I can't hear you guys.
Okay.
We're all talking over each other.
Oh,
What
yes.
did you just say?
The deficit. We're just talking about the politics of a deficit.
Well, it was interesting to see, as you mentioned, Vashi, during the election campaign, just in terms of how much the Conservatives were promising as well. And then balancing, the balancing of the budget kept moving a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further. So yeah, the rhetoric has definitely changed on that front in terms of how much spending is acceptable for certain political parties that you didn't normally see on that side of the spectrum.
Katie, I have a NAFTA question for you.
NAFTA.
Breaking news. I had it. Let me find it. Kazim Badruddin on YouTube asks, how do you think the American election coming up next year impacted the urgency to get NAFTA done?
There certainly was a push because the Canadians were very concerned that there were two events that were going to overshadow the ratification of the new NAFTA. And unless all three countries ratify it, you can't actually bring it into force. It doesn't actually kick in. So there are two key things going on in the United States in the next, say, 12 months or so. One, which is today, is impeachment and what's going to play out in the early stages of next year. There's likely going to be a trial in the Senate, and that is something that will take up at least a month of time. And while that takes center stage in Washington, the people who are really pushing to get NAFTA ratified, they could be basically met on no one listening to them because they're dealing with other bigger things. And then once the impeachment cycle sort of tapers off, you've got to deal with the election cycle. And so there was a very serious concern from the Canadians, at least, that all of the hard work that had gone into the last 2 years could be for nothing if they didn't get this through. And so the fact that the Mexicans did agree to some significant concessions from the revamped NAFTA from 2018, and then to 2019 NAFTA, that was really sort of seen as the catalyst. Canada has tried really hard to take credit for some of the progressive ideas, because you'll remember the Liberals, when they presented some things that they wanted included in NAFTA, some of them were very progressive. Things like environmental standards, they wanted a chapter on gender. The Conservatives accused them of wasting the Trump administration's time with frivolous asks. But at the end of the day, they knew that the political landscape in Washington could change. The Democrats took the majority in the House. You need to have the Democrats to get it across the line. And after all of these negotiations, it finally has sort of come to that space. And it turns out Canada might actually be the last country to ratify it, because Canada doesn't come back.
It's a timing thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a timing thing. I'm sure it will be ratified. I don't anticipate anything significantly, any significant challenge to it. Yes, the Conservatives will ask questions. Yes, the Conservatives will challenge it, but they're a free trade party.
Okay, Salima, I have a very lighthearted, easy question to ask you. Jean Pasta on Facebook asks, what is the biggest threat to Canada right now?
What is the biggest threat to Canada right now?
Your face there was worth
So
the setup
lighthearted.
alone, yeah.
There are so many. Where to start? The biggest threat to Canada right now? I don't have an answer for that.
No? You don't know? What do you think the biggest, the biggest issues this government will be tasked with dealing with, however long its mandate? You've gone over climate change. What else do you think?
There's a lot there. Obviously, there's the premiers. There are a slew of different premiers, a little bit on the Conservative side of the spectrum, and this is what JP was talking about as well, the frustrations in a lot of the provinces. And most of the promises, of course, that the Liberal Party is moving forward with and wants to move forward with, the National Pharmacare Program, a lot of the other the promises that they made during the election campaign are based on cooperation from the provinces and dealing with the provinces in a different way. So, of course, that is why Justin Trudeau has sort of tasked Chrystia Freeland with the very high-powered job of Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, as well as Deputy Premier, to talk to the provinces and show that they are listening. Of course, in a minority situation as well, right? So Justin Trudeau and his Liberals have to sort of navigate this world with the provinces as well as the path in the House, trying to get support for everything that they want to pass, and with which party at which time. So it's an interesting time and an interesting new reality for the Liberals. But that question being so wide, I could have said so many things. What is that?
Okay, you gotta pick one. Yeah.
I don't know. You've got that internal domestic challenge that Salim outlined, but then there's just where Canada fits globally, right? Like the Trudeau and the government like to talk about how they're the only G7 country with free trade agreements to all the other G7s. And look, NAFTA's probably at the finish line, but we've been at the finish line before. But we've got Donald Trump disrupting the entire global order since he has been president. He is causing trade tension and trade wars with China, and Canada is caught up in that through no fault of its own. You have Britain now having a majority Conservative government. The unraveling of the European Union seems to be poised to happen. And again, this all has material impact on Canada. You have this uncertain...
But it's interesting. Sorry to interrupt, David, but it's interesting in that because, yes, there is all that turmoil internationally, but it really feels like the Liberals are turning inward domestically with the focuses with Chrystia Freeland, sort of the change in her position as well. So there's this turmoil outside that seemed to have been more the focus in the first mandate. And now there's a slight shift internally as we deal with this minority situation.
Yes, my point, I guess, is that all of this creates significant economic uncertainty. And going back to the deficit question, if you read the analysis of Canada's economic growth, the biggest risks are all global. It's all trade uncertainty and tariff retaliation and export challenges, and that all drags it down, which makes the domestic political situation more difficult to manage, which leads to income disparity, which leads to anger and rise of populism and all of the things they've been trying to deal with. So you're caught up in this rogue wave of global events that as a middle power and as a G7, but a modest G7 economy, these are factors that are really outside of Canada's ability to control, but which Canada has to manage.
Worship Warrior 12 on YouTube asks you, JP, how is Justin Trudeau going to solve the Alberta crisis? If he keeps going in the same direction on, and this is how he describes it, the so-called sea change, I imagine he means climate change policy, will he not lose country unity?
It's very much at risk, I think, truly. I think the Trans Mountain decision that's coming from the Federal Court of Appeal, likely in the next couple of months, really risks tearing apart the country. Because if the Federal Court of Appeal decides against the pipeline once again, which would quash cabinet approvals, which would halt construction again, years into this process, the Liberals are going to be in a bad spot, because what they've been saying all along to Alberta and Saskatchewan is, don't worry about the rest of it. We're going to get this pipeline built. This is a top priority for our government. We've risked so much political and actual capital on getting this thing built, and we'll see to it that it is. But if two Federal Court of Appeal decisions come down against that project, especially on the Indigenous front, which really puts them in a tough spot, because they've said that's the most important relationship to them as a government, man, what do they say to Alberta? They can't get anything done. Especially if it comes to the frontier mine, which they might not approve that project either. 7,500 jobs on the line, $75 billion in government revenues could come from that project. There's questions about whether it's actually viable for Teck Resources to build this massive project in Alberta's north. But if the government says no and Trans Mountain doesn't go through, I would be very worried about the future of this country. I think we would probably see a really well-organized opposition campaign to the Federation in places like Alberta, because they are feeling completely, I really don't want to underestimate just how there are feelings of alienation there. Like 20% unemployment rate among young men. These are like depression-level unemployment rates. They are really in dire straits. Like, as I said earlier, all investment has basically evaporated in this place, and they're feeling under attack by people who are pushing the climate agenda, rightly or wrongly. I mean, of course, this is a pending issue for the world, but they're feeling like this is taking a priority over their economic livelihood. It's not just in Alberta. We're seeing it in David's home province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Yeah. This was supposed to be the ticket out of poverty for a province that has long suffered from that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. By having offshore oil development, like what we're seeing in Hibernia. Is that even viable moving forward? This is not just a concern for Alberta. It's a huge thing in Saskatchewan as well, and LNG in British Columbia is also seen as a livelihood, or the future livelihood of a province, when something like forestry might take a back seat moving forward. So this whole natural resources conversation is really a pressing concern, and I don't know how the government's going to do this delicate dance. They've been very clear that their top priority is the environment and climate change, and natural resources, which is our largest export as a country, which is the largest contributor to our gross domestic product, kind of taking a back seat.
On that lighthearted note, no, I'm kidding. That was a very good answer. We have just a few minutes left, I believe, and I would like to interject with my own question. We asked the Premier's League also the same question at the end of that sort of extra special time, what their New Year's resolutions are, and you can say for yourself or for or some politician or political something or other. Okay, Salima, I'll start with you.
I actually never make New Year's resolutions because I tend to break them very quickly. So I generally don't. But I can try to make an exception for you.
Thank you.
My New Year's resolution is just to follow the ups and downs and keep at it. Basically, throw all the questions in every situation. It's going to be a really interesting, obviously, year, and when Parliament comes back, a really interesting situation, because obviously we only saw the House come back for a very short time, a very specific thing that they wanted to pass, the Liberals to pass. So I think it'll be really interesting to see the workings of the new minority parliament, how the Liberals go about getting their legislation passed and getting folks on board. So it's going to be a rock and roll 2 years. So I'm really looking forward to it.
As we all are. JP?
Eat more salad.
I saw you try to do that last January.
I tried the keto diet for a moment, but
yeah, I remember
fell
those
off
days.
the wagon real quick. No, I think honestly, be healthier. This job is very it's very stressful. I don't have a good work-life balance, so I think just having a healthier lifestyle, because I'm not that old, and yet I feel like my body has aged a lot since I started working here.
Katie, you're headed to Washington.
This is how journalism ages you. 22. I'm not 22. For me, I'm moving, so I'm in I'm moving to Washington, so I'm in a very different sort of headspace about that. But for me, it'll be. You know what? You know what's really hard to do that I very much want to do is get what's called a hard pass for the White House. You know how we have passes to go up to Parliament Hill?
Yeah.
This is very much a reportery thing. I'm so sorry, but this is I really want this. You have to show up at the White House every day. And if you keep going every single day, they will grant you what's called a hard pass. So you are like a certified journalist who can go to the White House anytime, and we can go break news, we can go shout questions at Donald Trump, and you're like a full-fledged, you're actually there, you're reporting. And under the Trump administration, they've cracked down on a lot of reporters have lost especially Canadian reporters have lost their hard passes.
If anyone can get it, you can.
Well, I'm going to try and do that, and then dry January. I tried dry January.
I remember you trying that last year too.
4 days.
Okay, well, best of luck.
That's why I don't make New Year's resolutions.
David, yourself?
I think I'm going to have a resolution for the politicians in Ottawa on Parliament Hill. When we get access to them, we have this convention of you get one question and one follow-up. And often they resort to message tracks. So my resolution for the politicians would be answer the first question so the follow-up can be an actual follow-up and not just an attempt to get them to actually answer the first question. Because if we're going to play by these rules, we should live by these rules, and one side does not.
If I could marry that answer, I would.
Oh, here's the thing. Also, fewer word salads for the politicians.
Word salad.
There we go. We're combining.
I'm guilty of a word salad every once in a while, too.
combining.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our reporters for
Ashley.
taking all these questions and for all your work this year. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show all the
You
time.
got it.
Our pleasure.
It means so much to us. Thanks to Salima Shivji, Katie Simpson, David Cochran, and JP Tasker. And thank you all for your excellent questions.